Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? Well, I'd like to welcome you to this third instalment of the anniversary, the 25th anniversary celebration of the Centre for Hellenic Studies here at King's College London. My name is Roderick Beaton. I'm director of the centre, and I'm going to say just a very few words to welcome you and to set this event in its context. And then I will pass on to my colleague Dionysios Stathakopoulos, who will introduce the speaker. Before we start, and I think this may be said again later before we finish, we were hoping to have hemlock cups available for anyone who'd like to take one home. However, the rain rather put the kibosh on that. So Bethany has kindly told us that if people who are attending would like a signed copy of the Hemlock Cup, entirely non-toxic, I am assured, you can contact her via the website, and she has an arrangement whereby a signed copy can be sent to you. Well, today is the 29th of May. For those of us involved in Hellenic studies, not an entirely auspicious day. The 29th of May 1453 was a Tuesday, and some people say that it's for that reason that Tuesday is an unlucky day in the modern Greek calendar to this day. This was the day of the fall of Constantinople, or the conquest of Istanbul by Mehmed the Conqueror in 1453. I mention that because in Hellenic studies at King's, we're very proud of our diachronic coverage of the Hellenic world from remote prehistory right down to the current crisis, and we hope to the marvellous phoenix that's going to arise out of it one of these days. So we're proud of the fact that we cover the whole spectrum of Hellenic studies, and in celebrating 25 years, we've already had two very distinguished presentations on very different aspects of Hellenic culture, with the common theme, which is carrying on today, of why Greece matters today. 2 weeks ago, we had the UK ambassador to Greece, who, as it happens, is also a member of our centre here at King's, John Kitmer, speaking from the point of view of a serving ambassador who is also a scholar and linguist and very much involved with modern Greek culture. And last week, we had the Irish playwright Frank McGuinness, the librettist of the triumphantly successful new opera Thebans, having just recently had its premiere at the Colosseum, talking about power and passion in Greek drama. And goodness, there was lots of power and passion in that presentation. So we've already looked at very different aspects of Greece, Greek culture, ancient and modern, and how and why these are part of our culture that matter to us today. And now we're coming to the climax, the apex of our three events, in welcoming the broadcaster and award-winning writer Bethany Hughes, who is also, we're very pleased to have her as a research fellow here in the centre at King's, to talk about one of the most central, or perhaps two of the most central components of the legacy of Greece to all of the world, and they're there on the screen. One is Athens, the city of Athens and the ancient civilization of Athens, and the other is, was he the greatest thinker of all time? Socrates. So Bethany is going to talk about Socrates and Athens and why we still need to care about both today. Before I hand on to my colleague to introduce Bethany properly, I would just like also to record our thanks to our sponsors. This series of events is sponsored by the Greek presidency of the EU, to which we owe the wine that will be served upstairs afterwards. And tonight we owe a further debt to the Hellenic Foundation for Culture, and also a personal debt to the representation of the foundation, Dr. Victoria Solomonidis, in arranging for nibbles to accompany the reception. So with those thanks to our sponsors, I hand over to my colleague Dionysis, also known as Dennis Stathakopoulos, who will introduce our speaker, Bethany.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a cliche, of course, that, Bethany Hughes needs no introduction, but I am particularly delighted that I've been asked to introduce her. We know her, of course, since, for more than 10 years. We've read her, we've listened to her on the radio, we've watched her on TV, so she definitely doesn't need an introduction, but I thought I'd try. The first word that came to mind is, gratitude or debt. Because let's face it, I think we can all agree, ladies and gentlemen, we've all, for example, wanted to know what it feels or it felt like to be the face that launched 1,000 ships. And thanks to Bethany's Helen of Troy, we also know what it feels to ride a Mycenaean chariot. And I think you may not have, thought you wanted to know that, but now you do, and you're very happy for it. There's another word that, a key word that comes to mind. Envy. Of the good kind, may I hasten to add. And I'll tell you why. Some of my students, at various levels of their student life at King's, have gone on to support Bethany's various projects. Never have I seen them so enthusiastic about going to the library, about looking things up. Their eyes are lit up. They never did that with my essay. So, of course, I'm envious of that. And then there's another thing. Do you know how many people have actually watched her programs on the Greek World so far? 150 million people. So, what can I say? My last book sold, I think, 700 copies. So, you get the picture. But seriously, I think that for all of us who have watched her programs, who have read her books, who have listened to her radio shows, what makes Bethany special, what she manages to do, is to make us care. Of course, there's the great scholarship behind it, but there's great scholarship elsewhere. She manages to have this very personal approach and to weave narratives together and to ensure that the past really comes alive in many, many different ways. And one of the ways that I think is particularly special to her own approach has to do with the genius loci, with the genius of the place, the spirit of the place. She will tirelessly travel all around the world, and not just to nice and beautiful cities, but to all kinds of excavations and mountains and ridges, and you can see that she's ready to take us to all these places to make us really understand what it felt like, in Socrates, Athens, what it felt like in India, in China, in the Greek world, when those figures that she's talking about actually lived and breathed. And I think that's really, really special, the fact that she then, with all this work, she does manage to make us really care about these figures and to identify with them and to want to read them about them. As already said, today is the anniversary of the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Of course, a sad event, 1100 years of Byzantine history ended, but at the same time, I think, the dawn of something new. As historians, we try not to judge, we try to look at things and to make the best of them. And I think it's very, very fitting that Bethany, in fact, is giving her talk, which is not about Byzantium, but on this particular day, because, you know, I can think of fewer people that have been such great ambassadors, if you'd like, for Byzantium as well, with a number of programs, both on radio and on TV, and that might be, you know, something you don't know, a new and forthcoming book about Constantinople that we're all, you know, dying to read. So you see, from Athens and Socrates to the fall of Constantinople to London 2014, you know, it's not such a long way. I think there's also another aspect that is very fitting, namely that Bethany has been asked to give the third and final, to close this series of talks that celebrate the 25 years of the Center for Hellenic Studies. Because personally, I don't know of a better ambassador for Hellenism in all its very long history, and of Greece, than Bethany. And I sincerely hope, you know, that somebody from the Greek government is sitting here and will give her a permanent job, you know, to do this.
Great.
Because I think that would help turn a lot of things around. So, Bethany, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. Well, what can I say? Thank you. The terrible thing about having a wonderful introduction like that is I now have to live up to it, don't I? But Dennis, really thank you. That was full of charis in the ancient Greek sense of the word. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of you for battling here this evening on this particularly filthy English summer's night. I will endeavour to bring a small amount of Mediterranean sunshine into the room. But thank you too to King's for inviting me. I'm always so thrilled to support the work of King's because it is such an excellent institution in every way. But in particular, I think, to support the 25th anniversary of the Centre for Hellenic Studies, because I think we should all just take a moment and think of that number, 25 years. The centre didn't establish itself. There had to be people who grouped together with vision who decided that this would be a good idea. And I know from bitter experience that 25 years ago, Hellenism and the classics and ancient history were not fashionable and groovy. There were not television programs being made about them. All of us who love this were told that we were working in basically dead-end jobs with dead languages, and we might as well just kind of crawl away and die under a stone somewhere. When I was at Oxford 25 years ago, the classics faculty was threatened with closure. So well done for those people who founded it 25 years ago and have had the tenacity to keep it going for so long. I have many favourite Greek words, but one of them is idiotes, idiotai, which of course I'm sure all of you here know used to mean in ancient Greece people who were just concerned with the personal and the private rather than the public good. And I would say tonight, officially and rarely, there are no idiots in this room. All of you, by being here, are supporting the public good. Actually, very interesting, you say I kind of travel a lot to do my research. Precisely this time last year, I was in Istanbul, and after the 29th, where I went to a sort of celebration of the conquest of Constantinople, of Istanbul, and then got rather annoyingly caught up in the Taksim Square riots with my two teenage daughters being tear-gassed. And there was a moment when I thought, this is, you know, I'm being this feisty British mother. And then one of them said, actually, Mum, I can't breathe. So we had to kind of rush off and get her dealt with. And I would much rather be here with you today on this celebration. So we're going to talk about Socrates and Athens, 24 centuries of reception, 70 years of a life lived in 45 minutes. So forgive me if I rattle through a bit. But I thought it was very important to ask a question of why we need to care about that particular man, Socrates, and that particular time and place, Athens, in the 5th century. And I was sparked to give that as the title for the talk, actually because of a question I was asked by a journalist when I'd been writing my book on Socrates. And he rang up and he said, so Bethany Hughes, Why is Socrates relevant? Why should any of us care about him and his life and his work? And I did feel like saying, well, how long have you got? Or sending him away with a flea in his ear, but I was very well behaved and polite. And instead, I just spoke about the reasons I think we do all have to care about this man. I said, just consider this, purely in terms of interest. He is an interesting character. This is a man who lived and witnessed firsthand what has been known as the Greek miracle. He lived in a world as the world was working out how to live with itself. He breathed the same air, he walked on the same streets as all those greats of ancient Athens, Euripides, Pericles, Aeschylus, Sophocles. So of course he matters. He matters because this is a man who we're told was condemned to death or encouraged to take part in state-sponsored suicide for speaking freely. And yet Athens was a city that really fetishized freedom. There were freedom colonnades in Athens in the 5th century. They named their warships, one of their triremes, freedom. They debated freedom of expression and how far freedom of expression should be allowed to continue in the city. And yet this man is condemned for speaking freely. He asks fundamental questions of what it is to be human. How can you be happy? What is virtue? What is the good? So really, he's not exploring the meaning of life, but he is exploring the meaning of our own lives by doing so. And of course, in that famous aphorism, the unexamined life is not worth living for a man, which Plato tells us was his, in those 10 words in the English translation, really, I would argue that he gives us the modern world, because he tells us that inquiry is not seditious, it is central to what it is to be human. So I gave this great peroration to this journalist who went up and dutifully typed up an article about why Athens was so great, why Socrates was so important. And as I put the phone down, I had this kind of horrible sinking feeling. I thought, actually, he's asked me the wrong question. He shouldn't have asked me, why should we care about Socrates? What he should have said is, how on earth did you, Bettany Hughes, dare to try to write a biography of this man? I'm not a philosopher, I'm an ancient historian. And for any of those who know, Socrates isn't really the most obvious of biographical subjects. If you want to write a biography, this is just my tip to you as somebody who writes for the general market. What you do if you're writing a biography is you choose a character who everybody has heard of. Well, we've got that with Socrates. You then choose a character about whom very little has been written. And yet there isn't a single decade in the last 24 centuries when Socrates has left the human radar. He has always been talked about, painted, discussed, debated. What you also hope, the biography, is that you're suddenly going to say that you found this fantastic cache of private correspondence, which is really going to shed light on the man. And as we probably all know, that's very unlikely with Socrates, because this was a man who was allergic to the written word. There's a very, very beautiful passage in Plato's Phaedrus where we hear that Socrates is really exploring ideas through the mouthpiece of others, where he says, the problem with the written word is that as soon as it goes out into the public, it becomes an orphan. It doesn't have its father to protect it. And I think that's something that we all understand, having sent any kind of an email, which then arrives and is completely misunderstood. You just wish you could be there and take your child back and explain what you meant. But Socrates didn't do that. Socrates absolutely avoided the written word, even though Athens, at the time of his flourishing, really was becoming a city of words. There were words everywhere, on the walls, on the streets, in inscriptions, because the workings of the democracy had to be publicized. So we don't have that. We don't have Socrates' ideas. So in a way, it could all be hearsay. He could be entirely made up. But it seems to me it is essential that we try to understand the truth of Socrates, but for two reasons. One, as I said, he wasn't exploring just the meaning of life, he was exploring the meaning of our own lives. And also, I think, and academia and public scholarship has been very guilty of this, we always look at Socrates through the wrong end of the telescope. We focus on his trial and his death, But if you read between the lines of Plato, and if you really try to imagine yourself inside the head of Socrates, this was a man who lived a vigorous life. His very purpose was to try to identify how to live the good life. How can we live well? So it seems entirely perverse just to focus on that moment, that single day of his trial, and then a month later of his death, when actually he's lived vigorously for 69 years before that. So I kind of comforted myself that this was a task that was worthwhile, and then was speaking at a literary festival about Socrates, and I sat down at breakfast the morning after the talk with an author, which is what always happens at these literary festivals, is a man called Mark Haddon, who you probably know, who wrote The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night-Time. A classicist, by the way, all the best people are. What happens at these literary festivals is terribly awkward, because as writers, you're not sort of, social chat isn't what you're best at, really. And so we had this rather sort of stilted conversation, asked what we always ask: what are you doing now? What are you doing now? And of course, you're writers, you're writing, so you know what the answer is going to be. So anyway, I asked him what he was doing, and he said, I'm writing. He said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm writing. I'm writing this book on Socrates. And he said, oh, fantastic, that's the most brilliant donut subject, because it's really rich and satisfying, but with a great big hole in the middle where the central character should be. So as I was writing, and I had this kind of spectral donut hovering over my shoulder, but I'd just like to explain to you now why I think it is not an entirely specious task to try to understand Socrates and to try to understand Athens, and why the two have to be understood by us in the 21st century. The first is this: when you write a biography of somebody, it's never just a biography. It's, if you're kind of turning it back into Greek, it's a biographia. It's a collection of many lives that gather together to make up one life. So what we do have with Socrates is that we have detailed evidence of those who lived around him. This is obviously a neoclassical painting rather than a classical one. This is by Jean-Léon Gérôme from the 19th century. And here you have Socrates rescuing Alcibiades from the house of Aspasia. So these are some of the characters that we come across. Alcibiades, of course, those famous prostitutes of Athens. And there are others. There are Aristophanes, who clearly wrote about Socrates, Xenophon too, and Plato. So if we look at their lives, it's almost as if we can jigsaw puzzle together evidence around a kind of Socrates-shaped whole. Plato, obviously a great follower of Socrates. These are Plato's words. This is Socrates' face. When we're reading Plato, are we in any sense hearing Socrates? Is he speaking to us through Plato's lines? So much ink has been spilt on this, and in some ways we can think of Plato as a false friend, because Plato himself, mischievous, so smart, so opinionated. In a way, how can we possibly read Plato and expect Socrates to come through? There's an interesting thing if you now look at Plato's work and kind of read it with this image in mind. Are there any neuroscientists in the room? I can say anything, can't I, and get away with it. But I had very interesting sessions with neuroscientists when I was writing this book. So I was talking about Plato and his memory and saying, how far can we trust Plato's memories? He's so much younger than Socrates. Is this all going to be made up, or is he actually going to be passing on some kind of verbatim account of his life? And the neuroscientist said to me, well, we're really understanding now the value of episodic memory in history. So episodic memory is when you have something very visual in your mind, and we remember much better in images than we do in words. So if I were to say to any of you, what did you do last weekend? What will come into your head is not a series of beautifully written paragraphs or kind of bullet points. There will be an image. You'll remember something that you did, and there'll be an image of that. And what we think we're now finding with Plato is when he's writing in beautiful, minute detail about the Athens that Socrates inhabited, he is actually recording verbatim what he saw around him. And the archaeology is backing us up with that. So when we hear that Socrates wanders down barefoot and he listens to the cicadas chirping, he hears birds, he wanders by the streams, he's shaded by certain kinds of foliage, all this is now turning up in the archaeological record. And there's a particularly beautiful example of that in the Lysis, when we hear that Socrates went from the academy to the Lyceum. He stops by a string and he has a chat with some young men. And that precise wrestling ground, as described in Plato, is now emerging from the earth. It was first excavated in the 1920s. There's been continuous excavations since then, a lot of recent work with the establishment of the metro and the 2004 Olympics. And so we now know that we can actually graft the archaeology onto Plato's words. So I think that we can use Plato, as I said, if we're going to try to sort of jigsaw puzzle together around this whole. What we absolutely have is the archaeology. How many Athenians are there in the audience? I suspect there are a few, yeah, a few. Okay, so you know there's been a lot of digging in Athens over the last 10 years or so. Because of this new metro system, because of the work around the Olympics, a huge amount of very exciting archaeology has come out of the earth in Athens. I put this in just because I love this image. This is the first official day of the digs, May 1931, when finally the houses have been cleared from the agora and the men could get to work with their shovels to try to discover the 5th century and the ancient agora beneath. Of course, the work there continues. Professor John Camp is doing amazing work out in Athens. If you go, please do go. I know that the crisis is slightly abating, but I think Greece still needs all your euros, so book yourself a flight as soon as you leave this room. If you go to Athens and you walk down the Plaka, Adrianou Street, the kind of main street with all the slightly, dare I say, tacky shops on either side, kind of go down to the end, the agora is on your left, and if you just look to the right, you'll see there are excavations going on. What's being excavated there is the painted stoa, the stoa Poikile, which will be open to the public, we think probably in 5 years or so. And this is where all those philosophers walked, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and it's coming out of the ground now. I'm being filmed, so I can't say this. Well, I will. I'll hint at it. There was a taverna over above the paint where the painted stoa was, and everybody knew the painted stoa was underneath his taverna. And for years and years and years and years, he refused to budge. Okay, he said, no, this is my family business. I'm not going to go. And sort of now he's gone, and I just wonder if there were a few brown envelopes of euros that gently made their way. I don't know. For the filming, I'm not sure that didn't actually happen. But anyway, we can now get down to the painted stoa. So there's all kinds of exciting material. Anybody who's been to Athens will have been to the new Acropolis Museum, where very cleverly your glass floor is the glass ceiling of digs 20 feet or so beneath your feet, where you are walking above the Byzantine, the Roman, the ancient Athenian, the 5th century Athenian city. Not much of 5th century Athens is visible, it's just a drain. But if you like 5th century Athens, you can go and commune with the drain beneath your feet. So we do have archaeology on our side if we're trying to piece together this story. Archaeology in Athens, though, can be a challenged thing. I am, as has been said, a great Phil Hellene, so I say this in the most supportive way. What you're looking at here is really a world monument, world-class, globally important. These are the long walls of Athens that went down from the Athens city centre down to the Piraeus. I don't know if you can see, I hope the lighting's all right. I would say pretty much everything that can be thrown at an ancient monument by the modern world has been thrown at this particular monument. If you can see over one side, you've got an attractive train route. These large grey pillars support a motorway above the wall. This is an industrial canal gently making its way across. And then just for good measure, some mains cable electricity has been lovingly draped over the edge. And when I went to visit these long walls, just sort of try to imagine what it was like when these were being built, I looked at this little spot and I thought, oh, that's fantastic. I can jump down there. I can really get close to the experience of the 5th century. And as I jumped into that little hole, there is a terrible kind of crunch of glass beneath my feet. And I realised that this is a hangout for all the local heroin addicts. So that's actually full of old syringes. So sometimes the archaeology of Athens doesn't quite immediately kind of allow you to be in 2 times at once, but there is still an enormous amount of it, and it's very exciting. So I think, you know, if we use this, as I said, we can try to jigsaw puzzle together Socrates' story. So what I'd like you to do is just to close your eyes and imagine yourself back 24 centuries. The year is 469 BC. Athens is a city which has had a run of both good luck and good judgment. It's done this extraordinary thing of managing to defeat the great, the vast, the petrifying Persian Empire. And it's into this can-do atmosphere that in the southeast of Athens, in the Deme district of Alopeke, a boy child is born, Socrates. We're told that he's born to parents his mother was a midwife and his father was a stonemason. And again, is this just allegorical? Are we talking about Socrates as a midwife to ideas? Are we kind of proving his artisan democratic roots? Actually, Alopeke is still the marble working district in Athens, so I think there's no doubt there's been continuous marble working there. So there's no reason for us to think that Socrates' father was not indeed a marble worker. And I'd like to say that he woke up every morning and this was his view of the Acropolis, but of course this wasn't, because this, the Periclean Parthenon, was only built once Socrates had finished his childhood. Throughout his childhood, what he'd have woken up and seen every morning would have been the blackened, traumatized remains of the archaic Parthenon temple, which had been burnt to the ground by those invading Persian forces. And if you go into the New Acropolis Museum, you can see some of the statuary from that archaic temple, where the surface of the stone has been blistered and buckled and burnt in the heat of Persian fires. And it's worth just having a look at that, because you really get a sense of the kind of agony of that moment. And that is what Socrates would have seen every morning. And it makes you wonder whether one of the reasons that Socrates searched for the good, constantly inquired, how do we live a good life? What is the good? Whether that was because actually, even though he was in an optimistic city in some ways, he was also surrounded day in, day out by a great deal that was very bad. And we'll see that as we kind of go further into his life in chronological terms. So Socrates, we're told, had a childhood very like all those other young boys of Athens. There would have been a slave to teach him. We're told he ran away as a truant from his father and kind of lived the regular life of an Athenian citizen. I popped this image in only because it's so rare. I'm sure there are many classicists and ancient historians in the room, but as you know, it's very rare for us to find a kind of day-to-day scene like this represented on vases. And this is in the Ashmolean, so you can nip up to Oxford to have a look at it. The scene of a cobbler's workshop. We don't know whether this is a child who's having their shoes fitted, or whether that figure has just been squashed by the artist to fit into the vase, but an everyday scene. And we're also told that later in his life, this is one of the places that Socrates goes to a cobbler's workshop, in order to test out his ideas with the young men of Athens. He would also have lived a life that was very rigid in some ways, absolutely not laissez-faire. I think there's a very kind of common misconception of Athens in the 5th century that it was full of men who were very high-minded, who were constantly exploring the limits of life. And that's not true. This was in many ways a very limited existence. There were certain things that you could do at certain times of the year and at certain times of your life. And age division was terribly important. So we know that the children of Athens, the kind of those who just coming out of toddlerhood, age 2 or 3, they would be accepted into the city-state. They would have their names inscribed on a list. Really, this is welcoming them into the community, but it's also proving that they have survived those childhood diseases that took away the vast majority of children. The estimates are going up and up. We think that probably about 90% of children who were born died before the age of 2 in Athens. So death was an experience of the very young rather than of the elderly at this time. And one of the kind of celebrations of the fact that you'd reach this stage is that you'd take part in this rather brilliant festival, all in honour of the god Dionysus, which is a swinging festival. So you'd be sort of swung into the community, which is a rather lovely idea. And there's some very interesting academic work actually going on at the moment where this swinging festival also involved teenage girls. A lot of it was done in honour of a mythical character who was said to have killed herself. And there's a notion that this swinging was thought to sort of swing the contagion of suicide out of young teenagers. And again, it's one of those things when you think we talk about the relevance of the ancient world, teenage suicide is a terrible problem for us. It's been a great problem for teenage girls. And I think you've read in the papers today, there's been this kind of massive 5 suicides following the use of a particular computer game. Well, isn't it interesting that even in ancient Athens, where there were no computer games, there was no Facebook, there was still this notion that suicide was somehow contagious amongst teenagers, and the community had to act together to try to present it. But anyway, Socrates, there we are. This, we can imagine, this is the little boy Socrates singing away. And I would love to say that I've got an image of Socrates as a 10-year-old child growing up, but I haven't. I can instead give you these lovely young girls, a recent archaeological discovery. This is just a scrap. It's a silly little bit of pot that was thrown away in the Agora, in the southeast corner of the Agora. A bit of rubbish. Wells, as you know, for archaeologists, are fantastic resources. All kinds of things get dropped in there by accident or thrown in in order to get rid of it. I don't know if you agree. I think this is just a very beautiful bit of artwork. It seems so fluid and light, the way these girls are painted onto the ceramic. We're pretty certain that these are young girls who went out to worship in the sanctuary of Artemis in Brauron, that these are the girls that were then called the young bears, the little bears, who were sent out of Athens. It wasn't every girl aged 10, but there was a kind of representative number of them, who were sent out of Athens in order to run the wild animal out of them, was the idea. So these girls would live together in this kind of little boarding school, religious boarding school, for 2 or 3 years. We're told that they raced a lot together, sometimes that they put on bear skins and chased one another. So it sounds like a kind of St. Trinians with religious attitude. And the notion was that once they'd run the wild animal out of them, they would then come back to Athens ready to be good Athenian wives. Why I wanted to show you this, apart from just, I think it's a beautiful thing, and we're very lucky that we're getting all this new archaeology, again, as I said, to sort of jigsaw puzzle together this story. Very interesting what Socrates does with women, and I think pretty quickly in the Socratic story, we see that Socrates is absolutely magnetic and mesmeric in many ways, but always just slightly out of kilter with the status quo. And he is absolutely not a proto-feminist. There is a very interesting academic article that's claiming him as the first feminist, which I think is slightly fanciful. But it is interesting what Socrates does with women. This line that we have from Plato, where it said, women are 50% of the population, so isn't it just sensible that we put them to good use? And his admiration of the Spartan regime, where women and young girls definitely had more freedoms. And I think just very interesting, if we can imagine this young man growing up, watching the world with clear sight, watching the young women that he saw around him, and imagining what their potential could be. The young men too, of course, utterly totemic to 5th century Athens. This is a head that was found in the northeast corner of the National Gardens. I think it was when the metro was being dug rather than work on the Olympics. I'm sorry that we've got kind of quite bright light here, but it's a very powerful image, probably made to commemorate that victory over the Spartans in 480 BC. Beautifully defined eyelashes, it would have had rock crystal eyes staring out at you. But what's interesting about this head of a young man is that it's been reused when Socrates too was a young man, when he'd have been about 20, and set into the wall of a sanctuary of Asclepius. So it was a kind of apotropaic symbol, the idea that this young man was put in there to ward off evil spirits and evil forces, because the young meant a great deal to the city-states at this time, and in particular to Athens, that was increasing its military ambition. So the young men really who are memorialized before they go to war are desperately important to the city-state, and we have to remember that when we think of the anxiety there is around Socrates corrupting the young, getting them to do that thing that we talked about at the beginning of making inquiry central to what it is to be human, rather than something which is seditious. So as Socrates was growing up as a young man himself, so was this word idea, this extraordinary word, democracy, demokratia. This is brilliant Eugene van der Poel, one of Professor Camp's predecessors, looking actually a slightly later stele here. This is from the 4th century, and if you look at the detail, this is an image of hot Demos being crowned. So Democratia has now become a goddess, and she is crowning the people. And pretty quickly, democracy is worshipped as a goddess, and this idea catches on like wildfire in the Athenian city-state. You find it starts to crop up in the lines of dramatists, and well-to-do aristocrats start to call their eldest sons Democrates, so they give them the name of this new idea. And I was actually lecturing at Cornell University, and I said, well, you know, crazy, this idea of giving your son the name Democrates. I mean, what would we call them today? I don't know what we call them in the kind of current political climate, kind of lib con or something, I don't know. And it obviously wouldn't happen now. And then a lad put up his hand and said, well, actually, it does happen, because during the Arab Spring in Egypt, one of the lead protesters was in Tahrir Square, and he had a text through from his wife. He said, it's fantastic news. I've just given birth to a girl. You have a daughter. What shall we call her? What shall her name be? And the protester texted back and said, she shall be called Facebook. Because for him, Facebook was the agent that had changed his life and made, in his eyes, a whole new world possible. So there is somewhere now, some poor little, when was he, a sort of 3 or 4-year-old girl wandering around called Facebook. So interesting again, I think, that for that journalist saying, what kind of connections can we possibly have to those who lived 24 centuries ago? Well, we do exactly the same now as they were doing then in some ways. So democracy is growing up, it's finding its feet, but Socrates isn't caught up, it seems, in this kind of fervour, this kind of fantasy idea of the power of the word idea, democracy. He questions it pretty early on. And I think it's something that, again, we can understand now. Democracy isn't a magic wand. You don't toss it out as a panacea. The Democratic Republic of Congo is not democratic because it's got that word in its title. And I've just popped this in because this is in the Epigraphical Museum, and it's kind of for people who work on stele. It's very exciting because it's just been, it's 2 fragments that have been joined together. And this is where we first find hot demos, the people, described as a political unit. But what's very interesting is they're described as a political unit that can be taxed. This is the people from the islands of Salamis. And Socrates is onto that. He notices pretty quickly that this exciting, intoxicating word idea, democracy, is also used to fatten the banks of the Athenians, to enlarge those treasuries, that it becomes something that's very hard to argue against. And so triremes start to nudge their way out from the Piraeus and nudge their way into harbours and go to islands like Milos, famously, and say, you want to be democrats, don't you? Look at the size of our navy. So democracy isn't a pure word, and it doesn't actually start as that. It starts, as I said, interestingly, as a political word that is to do with the potential for raising money. And what a lot of money that early democracy managed to raise. I'm sorry about me in there, I'm just doing that to give you scale. If you haven't seen this, it's an amazing stele, again in the Epigraphical Museum in Athens. Line after line after line after line here. So that's one line there. So you can see just how much material is recorded on that stele. And these are all the city-states and the communities that owe tribute to Athens once it's become a democratic empire. So that represents a huge amount of material wealth flooding into Athens. Most people think this is a great idea. Again, Socrates is brave enough to set himself aside from that and question the value of this kind of rampant materialism. It's a later source, I'm sure it's apocryphal, but we're told that he strides through the agora, looking at all the stalls and saying, how many things I don't need, which is exactly how I feel when I walk through John Lewis, I have to say. But it's, you know, he's sort of setting himself aside. He's refusing to be caught up in the, really the kind of demotic passion of the age. A lot of money coming to the city-state. These are actually cheap because these are from Aegina, This is work that the University of Copenhagen's been doing on the statues, but they are from exactly the right period. They're from the 5th century. So looking at the marble, we can now work out how these statues were painted and decorated. I just wanted to put in this as a lovely archer from the Temple of Aegina. So when you think of Athens, and when you think of Socrates in Athens, these are the kinds of images, we're talking about episodic memories, these are the kinds of images that you have to have in your heads, because this is the kind of artwork that would have been surrounding Socrates as he walked through those city streets. Bright and gaudy and kind of out there and in your face. But the problem with this kind of very outward show of wealth and optimism and positivity is that people start to get jealous. We talked about envy in the introduction. As soon as you put your jewels on display, there are thieves who want to get their hands on them. And so Athens, which up until this point has been given rather beautiful epithets by other city-states, violet crowned, now starts to be called other things. It starts to be described as busybody, as oily, as sleek. And of course, those who want to get their hands on Athenian jewels or on the idea that Athens are promoting are the Spartans. And so Socrates really, for the majority of his middle-aged years, lives through a city-state which is going through this war of attrition with their one-time allies, bitter enemies, the Spartans. And Socrates was a soldier. And again, I think we lose sight of that often. When we think of him, we imagine this kind of grey-beard wafting around in the Greek equivalent of a toga, thinking extraordinary thoughts. But he was on campaign. We think he probably thought, Michael Trapp might disagree with this, probably about 20, 22 battles, actual conflicts that we think. We have descriptions of 3, but we think he probably engaged in 20 or 22. So that's a lot of fighting, again, a lot of bad that Socrates was surrounded with. We know in particular about the campaigns at Potidæa that they were hideous things. This is where Socrates would have stood outside as a soldier, knowing that he'd besieged a city where those inside the city had had to turn to cannibalism in order to survive. In the Battle of Delion, the bodies were left on the battlefield to rot for 17 days. This is all what Socrates would have witnessed. And again, maybe these are why he's so propelled to try to find the good. So this is the kind of, if you like, the kind of official image, the official face of Athens in the 5th century. And this is the actual face. Has anybody seen this little girl before? And yeah, so you know, this is Myrtis. She's been named by those who recreated her. Myrtis was a plague victim. So when Socrates comes back from some of his campaigns in 429 BC, he comes back to a city that really has become a charnel house because plague is raging through the streets. The bacteria that's causing it, we know, it having been extracted from the dental cavity of this young girl, is Salmonella enterica cerevisiae typhi. And are there any doctors? No neuroscientists. Are there any doctors? It's a little horrible viva. Do you know what that is? Yeah, and typhoid fever, yeah. So the plague of Athens we now know was typhoid fever. And this young girl, Myrtis, was 11. It's her dental cavity that was used to extract the bacteria, and her skull was almost perfectly formed, so people have managed to recreate her face. I think it's just quite interesting to see her, the fact that we think she's probably a redhead. She doesn't look kind of typically Athenian necessarily, but this in a way is the reality of Athens in 5th century. Towards the end of the 5th century, a city that has had extraordinary optimism and has now really watched the milk and honey experiment of democracy curdle. And it's a city that has allowed Socrates to ask questions for close on 50 years, but that towards the end of his life has become so fragile that it really wants answers. If you're a city that's suffered, you don't want people to ask these irritating questions. You want truths. So here is young Myrtis, and here is another little example of the kind of difficulty of Athens at this time. This is in the Kerameikos Museum. I don't know if you can see what it is. It's a lead figure of a man who's had his arms tied behind his back, and he's been buried in a little lead coffin. It's Mneisimakos is the name, and there's a curse written on the top of this little coffin. So this is obviously a legal dispute, and those who want Mneas Symmachos to suffer the ire of the gods and the spirits that they're summoning into the courtroom. There's only one on display in the Kerameikos, but actually there are lots and lots and lots of these little cursed figures and cursed tablets that are now emerging. Again, Professor Campbell talks about the new written material that's coming out of the Agora. A lot of it is ABCs, people being taught to read and write, to deal with this huge amount of writing which is now appearing in newly democratic Athens. But 50% of it are curses. So these are Athenians who are trying to summon the kind of darker spirits to their side in court cases. And actually, if you read them, they're so vicious. You sort of feel like saying, look, guys, you know, you've got a democracy, you've got an empire. I know things aren't great, but chill, because they're very, you know, there's one particular one which has just been dug up where a neighbour, a man has brought his neighbour to court, and he says, as he walked into the court, I would like to watch as his limbs drop off one by one. I'd like to watch as his eyeball falls out, and with his remaining foot, he stamps on his own eyeball. And you sort of, as I say, you sort of think, gosh, chill, chaps, you know, this is the golden age, don't forget. But I think it's very important for us to remember images like this and bits of archaeology like this if we're going to understand what it was that Socrates was up against, how brave it was of him to continue to ask these questions, and also to understand how it is that he ends up in that courtroom, judged by 500 or 501, the jury is still out, Athenian men who then encourage him to indulge in state-sponsored suicide. Socrates, we know, I'm just going to give you a more famous image of Socrates and his trial and death. Socrates, we know, dealt with his trial in I would say a quite cussy way. This isn't a man who is as humble as he should be. Normally, if you're taken to trial, if you're going to defend yourself, you prostrate yourself, you declare your sorrow, your humility, your wrongs, and Socrates refuses to do that. You will all know this in the room, but famously, when he's asked to commit his own defense and to describe the punishment that he should have, he says, I think because all I've done is work for the good of the city-state, I tell you what my punishment should be. You should just give me free dinners for the rest of my life. And this doesn't go down well in the courtroom. And the next time a vote is taken, there's a much greater majority that condemn him. It's story time, so that's why I'm going to read you out a little story then before our drink. Socrates, throughout his life, has watched the dreadful dying of men. He was there when humans slipped easily into barbarity and murdered countrymen, neighbours, family and friends. Dying in old age, surrounded by his best beloved, lying on a bed, is approximately his fate. It's not perhaps a bad end to a good life. His lack of interest in whether his body is buried or burned is palpable. It's the moment of passing that has always fascinated him. And perhaps this is why he covers his face as he dies, to experience this greatest of all journeys alone. It's the effects of poison hemlock that the prison official of Plato's Phaedo seems to demonstrate to Socrates' companion. And again, this kind of image is being criticised for over-romanticising the death of Socrates, because we're told that if you use water hemlock, you spew and you lose control of your bowels. It's a very agonising death. But actually, poison hemlock, which is what we think was used, does affect the body exactly as Plato describes. And passing upwards in this way, the jailer showed thus that he was growing cold and rigid. And then again he touched him and said that when the poison reached his heart, he would be gone. The chill had now reached the groin area. Poison hemlock does indeed attack the extremities first, often damaging the peripheral nerve, which is a massive single cell up to 4 feet long that runs from the spine to the toes. There is a terminal seizure as the brain is starved of oxygen, and this would normally be a violent spasm, but by this stage, all muscles are paralysed. They cannot convulse. So at the time of day when everyone is scurrying home, when the market stalls in the Agora are being cleaned of their wares, when unsold slaves are taken back to their shackles for the night, when slugged herb leaves and soiled spice is abandoned, when little boys scour the dust frantically searching for the thing that they have lost, without which a welcome home means a beating, Socrates is being terminated. We're told, as he said when he heard of his conviction at the trial, "Now I go to die and you to live. Who knows which is the better journey?" Who indeed, and I think we should not finish with Socrates' trial and death, because I said at the beginning, this was a man who lived life vigorously, and I think he would be appalled to think that there are lecture rooms all around the world where his death is being discussed in intimate detail. So I think let's just hear from Socrates and his passion for life at the end, which is another of the critical reasons we need to understand this man and the city he lived in. Socrates talks about love a great deal. Plato makes this very clear. The Symposium is a discussion about the nature of love, the nature of ta erotica. And it's a very, very difficult phrase to translate, but it seems to be that ta erotica are the lovely things, the things that make you smile when you wake up in the morning, a desire to search for wisdom and beauty and understanding and virtue. So if you read Plato, you hear time and time again, and also Xenophon, Socrates talking about the value of love in the world. Love, he says, is the one thing I understand. In Xenophon we hear, "I've never known a time when I was not in love with somebody." And there's a very beautiful, very difficult passage in the Symposium when we hear about the power of the god of love, Eros. This is Symposium 197d, 1 to E3. Eros draws the insularity out of us and pours familiarity into us. He encourages and catalyses all shared gatherings by taking the lead in festivities and sing-alongs, those habitual events that we love to attend, religious gatherings. He encourages cohesion and dismisses extremism. His currency is sympathy. Antagonism is given no quarter. He is gracious and gentle. He is adored by the wise, admired by the gods, craved when absent, prized when present. Hedonism, luxury, sensuality, delight, desire, ambition, and achievement. These are his children. Eros is our universal guide. And I say amen to that. I think we could all do with a bit more eros in our life, in the Socratic sense, that desire not just to live, but to live well, because that seems to me Socrates' central message, that we shouldn't just live, but we should love the living of it. We should have a passion for who we are and for what we do. So let's just hear from Socrates. And remember, all of you, that one of Socrates' definitions of the good life was men and women joining together and debating and having a dialogue face to face. So by being here tonight, you are, I think, the incarnation of the good life. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner and convincing him, saying, "My friend, why do you, who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, why do you care so much about laying up the greatest amount of wealth and honour and reputation, and yet you care so little for wisdom and truth and the improvement of the soul? Go on. Live life better." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we need to care about Socrates and the 5th century Athens that created him. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm in the usual combination of an awkward and a privileged position. Awkward because I'm the inconvenient person standing between you and the reception that follows shortly in chapters upstairs, and I'm asked to ask you all, when you leave this room, to leave by that door, so as to avoid colliding with other people doing other exciting things in King's at this precise moment. But I'm also in the privileged position of being able to express on everybody's behalf our thanks for what we've just heard. Because, of course, we remember our good manners, and not just our good manners, but our classical sense of the need for praise. Great deeds demand great praise, and great words are, in themselves, great deeds. We've just been treated to a wonderful re-evocation of Socrates in his living context, and of all that matters about him and about that context. We've benefited from Bettany's distinctive combination of an unparalleled ability to evoke a distant historical context and a lively tenacity in keeping the focus on what it all means now and how it can be experienced now. There is, of course, an enormous history of debate over Socrates, over Athens, and over the meaning of the relationship between them. Was Socrates the greatest glory of the city of Athens, or the greatest reproach on the Athenian democratic record? On whom did the trial and death reflect well, and on whom did it reflect badly? It's all too easy to get lost in the narrative detail of this long history of debate over the centuries. There are many enormously engaging monuments along the way, from Plato and Xenophon to Isidore Stone, and indeed Bettany herself. Bettany has kept our gaze on the living significance, the modern resonance of the man who, from now on, I suppose I shall have to think of as the great donut of the ancient world. What a feast we've had from a donut. Bettany, thank you so much.
Thank you. Very sweet. I just wonder if I can indulge myself and you with a Babylonian toast before we go and drink, in a kind of spirit of globalism. When men and women would join together in a room like this about 4,000 years ago, in order to prove that they stood on common ground and that they wanted to work together to a shared, better future, they would make a vow. And the vow was this: Anashulmi u Belatu, which means, loosely translated, to peace and to life. So I would like to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, Anashulmi u Belatu, to peace, to life, and to the glittering future of the Centre for Hellenic Studies. Thank you so much.